This is part 2 of project planning. And so week 4 focuses on how planning decisions shape delivery outcomes. Rather than treating planning as just generating documentation, this session approaches it as a set of decisions, managerial decisions involving tailoring, scheduling, costs, and procurement. This presentation is designed to walk us through planning as a connected system rather than a set of isolated topics. We'll begin with tailoring, which frames how planning should be adapted to the project context. And then from there, we'll move into schedule planning, focusing on how work is defined, sequenced, and structured. Then we'll shift into cost planning, including how costs are estimated, budgeted, and controlled. Then we'll explore procurement and sourcing decisions, including how projects engage with external vendors and how those relationships are structured and managed. And finally, we'll bring everything together by looking at how schedule, cost, and procurement decisions interact, followed by some takeaways in the role of planning in improving delivery outcomes. The goal is to see planning not as individual documents or document production, but as an integrated set of decisions that help to shape project performance. So why detailed planning matters? Well, detailed planning turns broad project intent into actionable decisions about how work will be delivered, sequenced, funded, and supported. In week 3, the focus was on defining project scope and building a clearer understanding of what the project expected to deliver. Now in week 4, planning becomes more detailed and more operational. The work shifts from defining the project as at a high level to deciding how that work will actually be organized, sequenced, funded, and supported. This is important because broad planning alone is not enough to guide project delivery. Once the scope is defined, the project team still needs to determine the most appropriate methods, the timing of the work, and the resources and costs involved, whether outside procurement would be necessary or not. These decisions make the project more actionable and help reduce uncertainty before execution begins. The topics this week reflect that shift. The syllabus identifies week 4 as focusing on tailoring project models, methods, and artifacts, planning the schedule, planning costs, and planning procurements and procurements management. These topics all work together because they translate planning from a broad structure to practical delivery decisions. A useful way to think about this is that detailed planning is what connects project definition to project readiness. It helps the team move from knowing what the project is to understanding how the project will be carried out in a disciplined and realistic way. Tailoring project models, methods, and artifacts. Projects perform better when models, methods, and artifacts are tailored to the project's context rather than applied the same way every time. One of the most important ideas in modern project management is that projects should not all be managed exactly the same way. Tailoring means adapting the models and methods and artifacts used on a project so they'll fit the actual situation rather than forcing every project into a standard template. And this is one of my predictions of where modern project management's going. We've got all these models, these approaches. We have, the traditional, and we have the adaptive and hybrid approaches. And under them, there's different lifecycle models that we can adopt. And I believe that especially with the tools, AI tools, it's going to make structuring these projects much easier and much faster, that eventually every project will have a customized model, a customized approach that is based on a model specific for that project. And the days of big giant PMOs where they set standards and you try to do every project with the same thing, regardless of how big or small it is, or how complicated it is, or how simple, the PMO is going to be moving more into project engineering, if you will, engineering the life cycle using tailoring. And the reason this is, I think, is important because projects differ in size, complexity, and uncertainty, stakeholder expectations, and even delivery approach. A project with stable requirements and a predictable environment, they need more formal documentation and tighter control. A project with evolving requirements or faster feedback cycles may need lighter documentation, more iterative planning, and more flexible artifacts. In the syllabus, we talk about tailoring project models, methods, and artifacts as one of the central topics this week. And this aligns closely with PMI's broader emphasis that project work should be adapted to the context rather than managed through universal formula. So PMI is kind of pushing us this direction as well. A key takeaway is that tailoring is not reducing the rigor of the project. It's selecting the right amount and type of rigor for the project. Good tailoring makes planning more relevant, more usable, and more effective. It helps the team avoid both extremes, over-managing simple work and under-managing complex work. So it helps the team avoid both of those extremes, over-managing simple work and under-managing complex work, which is the key takeaway. Choosing the right level of structure. Effective project planning applies the right level of structure for the project rather than assuming more documentation or more flexibility is always better. Tailoring becomes practical when we ask a simple question. How much structure does this project actually need? Not every project benefits from the same amount of documentation, governance, control, or flexibility. Some projects operate in stable environments with clearer requirements, stronger compliance expectations, and less tolerance for variation. Those projects often need more structure. Other projects operate with greater uncertainty, faster change, or evolving stakeholder needs. Those projects may need lighter structure and more adaptability. This connects directly to tailoring project models, methods, and artifacts. The point is not to choose between rigor and flexibility as if one is always better. The point is to choose the right level of structure for the actual project context. Too much structure can slow down decision-making, create unnecessary documentation, and add overhead that does not improve results. Too little structure can create ambiguity, weaken accountability, and make coordination, estimating, and control more difficult. Good project planning avoids both extremes. This slide is really about judgment. Project managers need to recognize when the project needs tighter control and when it needs lighter methods. Choosing the right level of structure helps make the project both disciplined and workable. Now we move to planning the schedule. Schedule planning converts defined project work into a realistic sequence of activities, timing, and delivery commitments. Once the project scope is defined and the work is more clearly structured, the next major planning question is timing. Schedule planning is the process of turning defined work into a realistic sequence of activities, durations, dependencies, and milestones. This is important because scope tells us what the project is expected to deliver, but the schedule helps determine when and in what order that work will happen. Without schedule planning, the project may have clear deliverables, but no reliable path for completing them in a coordinated way. The syllabus defines planning the schedule as one of the central Week 4 topics. In practice, schedule planning involves much more than just putting dates on a calendar. It requires thinking about activity definition, sequencing, durations, dependencies, and the logic of how work moves through time. The key takeaway here is that the schedule is not just a reporting tool. It's a planning tool that supports coordination, realistic delivery expectations, and later monitoring and control. A good schedule helps the team understand how the project is supposed to unfold and gives the project manager a stronger basis for performance management. From scope to activities and sequencing, a workable schedule begins by translating scope into activities and then arranging those activities in a logical order. Once the scope is defined, the next step in schedule planning is to break that scope into activities and then determine the order in which those activities should occur. In other words, scope tells us what the project must deliver, but activities and sequencing begin to explain how the work will unfold over time. This is important because projects are not completed as one large block of effort. They move through smaller units of work that depend on one another in different ways. Some activities must be completed before others begin. Some can happen at the same time, and some may depend on external inputs, approvals, or resource availability. This is where schedule planning becomes more analytical. The project team has to think through the logic of the work. That means identifying activities clearly enough to plan them and then sequencing them in a way that reflects real dependencies and practical execution order. The schedule's not just a list of dates, it's a structured representation of how work progresses. Good sequencing helps make the schedule more realistic, improves coordination, and reduces the risk of creating timelines that look neat on paper, but do not reflect how the project can actually be carried out. On this slide here, we have these sequence workflow, this network diagramming. Network diagramming used to be a real something we did. We'd use Post-it notes, or back in the day, we had magnetic boards that we could put right with a grease pen, write the task on it, and organize them in a logic for getting the work done. They look like this sequence workflow here. And you've got different relationships, finish, start, and start. There's not a start finish on here. And maybe this is start finish here. But we got basically 4 different types of dependency flow, if you will. And the idea was to put them together and identify the critical path. However, nowadays, the tools, if you use Microsoft Project or something like that, they will do this networking for you. And it's been a long time since I've done an entire project. What happens is you'll take a work package and maybe network out that work package and see what it's going to take to get the work package done as far as sequencing the activities. And then if you've got external dependencies or a dependency on another work package, you can identify those and expand the network. But that's kind of the gist behind this sequencing activities. Milestones, dependencies, and critical path thinking. Milestones and dependencies help organize the schedule logic, while critical path thinking highlights the sequence of work that most directly drives project completion. As the schedule becomes more detailed, 3 ideas become especially important, and that's milestone, dependencies, and critical path. And these ideas help the project team move from a list of activities to a more intelligent understanding of how the schedule actually works. Milestones are significant points in the project timeline. They do not usually represent long blocks of work themselves. Instead, they mark important achievements, decision points, approvals, or completion targets. Milestones help the team and the stakeholders see whether the project is progressing as expected. Dependencies show the relationship between activities. Some activities can't begin before other work is completed. Some may run at the same time, so that's like a start to start. These dependency relationships shape the logic of the schedule and determine how delays in one area may affect other parts of the project. Critical path thinking adds another level of insight. It focuses attention on the sequence of dependence activities that most directly determine the overall project duration. If one of those activities slips, the project finish date was likely to slip unless corrective action is taken. So the idea with critical path here is that it's the sequence of activities, or the longest sequence of activities throughout the project, where there's no float or slack in them. In other words, a delay in a predecessor will cause a delay in a successor, and that cascades on. It will eventually push the end date of the project out. And it's also another thing about critical path. It's the longest path of activities through the project, but it also represents the shortest amount of time to complete the project. So in other words, all that work has to be done in order for the project to complete. There's 2 ways to look at critical path. Milestones are generally something like we said here, they don't represent long blocks of work. They mark important things. Usually on a schedule, they're represented by these little triangles like this, and it's called a 0 duration activity or 0 duration task. So if you're going to put it in Microsoft Project, you'll put a task for that milestone and make it 0. And when you do that, project will create this it'll either be a little diamond shape or a little triangle, and it'll show it on the Gantt chart so you can see that. And one of the things I like to do with like a big chunk of work is I'll say, widget completed, and I'll have the milestone that's widget completed is the milestone, and you can link them all together with the sequencing, and if things move around, you can see the milestone move, and you can report that out. It's a signal that something's going on in the project. Planning cost. Cost planning translates project scope, schedule, resources now, and delivery choices into a financial view of what the project is expected to require. Cost planning is a natural extension of planning the work we've already discussed. So once we have a clearer picture of the scope, the activities, the sequencing, the resource needs, in other words, the schedule, it becomes possible to estimate what the work is likely to cost. At the foundational level, we should understand that cost planning is not merely an accounting exercise, it's a project decision-making activity. The financial picture of the project is shaped by what work will be done, how that work will be delivered, and who will perform it, how long it will take, and what outside goods or services might be required. This is why cost planning depends heavily on all of our earlier planning choices. If the scope is vague, the cost picture will be weak. If the schedule is unrealistic, cost expectations may also be unrealistic. If the delivery approach changes, cost structures may change as well. Cost planning also supports important management purposes. It helps sponsors and decision makers determine whether the project is affordable, whether funding is available when needed, and whether the expected investment aligns with the value the project is supposed to deliver. In practice, the goal is not perfect prediction, especially early in a project. Precision may be limited. The goal is to produce a reasonable, supportable estimate that helps guide decisions and provides a baseline for future control. To understand cost planning more clearly, we need to look at where project costs actually come from. Project costs come from people, resources, time, materials, services, and commitments required to deliver the work. After introducing cost planning, the next step is to understand where project costs actually originate. At the foundational level, project costs should be viewed as the financial expression of the work and the support needed to achieve the intended outcome. In many projects, labor is one of the largest cost drivers. The number of people involved, the level of expertise required, and the amount of time needed all directly affect cost. A project that requires highly specialized skills or sustained team effort over a long period will usually cost more than a simpler effort requiring fewer resources. Other costs come from the non-labor side of delivery. These may include materials, software, hardware, equipment, facilities, licenses, testing resources, or other inputs necessary to complete the work. In some cases, external vendors or contractors also contribute a substantial portion of total cost. The schedule also matters. Even when the scope remains the same, the timing and sequence of work can influence cost. A longer schedule may mean that resources are needed for a longer time. The compressed schedule may require added staffing over time, expedited purchasing, or other premium costs. We should also understand that some projects' costs come from uncertainty. Risk responses, contingency needs, rework, and approved changes can all affect the final financial picture. This one reason is why cost planning must be connected to other planning domains rather than treated as a standalone budgeting exercise. The important takeaway here is that project cost is produced by delivery reality. It reflects what the project needs in order to move from plan to execution. Once we understand the sources of cost, we can look at more directly at the difference between estimating costs and establishing a usable budget. Estimating versus budgeting. Estimating and budgeting are related but distinct. One forecasts costs while the other establishes control. At this stage, it's important to clearly distinguish between estimating and budgeting, as these concepts are often used interchangeably in casual conversation, but serve different purposes in project management. Cost estimation is about prediction. It involves developing an informed approximation of what the project or parts of the project are likely to cost. These estimates may be rough early on and become more refined as the project becomes better defined. Estimating is inherently uncertain, especially in early phases, and should be viewed as a progressively improving understanding rather than a fixed number. Budgeting, on the other hand, is about structure and control. Once estimates are developed, they are combined, aligned with the schedule, and organized into a formal budget. This budget is typically approved by sponsors and stakeholders or stakeholders and represents the authorized financial plan for the project. The budget also introduces accountability. It defines how much can be spent, when funding is needed, how performance is measured. And once established, it becomes a reference point for monitoring actual spending and evaluating the project, whether the project is staying within acceptable financial limits. This distinction is reflected in standard project management practice, where estimating cost and determining the budget are treated as related but separate planning activities. Estimating supports decision-making, while budgeting supports governance and control. You can estimate to understand cost, you budget to manage it. Now, with the budget in place, the next step is understanding how project costs are monitored and controlled during execution. A cost baseline provides a structured reference point for measuring project spending and managing costs. Once the project budget has been established, the next step is understanding how that budget is used during execution. This is where the concept of the cost baseline becomes important. The cost baseline is not just a total project budget. It's typically time phase, meaning it reflects how much money is expected to be spent at different points throughout the project. This aligns cost expectations with the schedule, helping the team to understand not only how much will be spent, but when. The time-based structure is critical for monitoring control. As the project progresses, actual spending can be compared against the baseline to determine whether the project is performing as expected. If spending is higher or lower than planned at a given point, that variance becomes a signal that something may need attention. For example, higher than expected costs might indicate inefficiencies, scope changes, delays, or underestimated work. Lower than expected costs might suggest delayed work, underutilized resources, or incomplete project. The key idea is that the baseline enables visibility. Without it, there's no meaningful way to assess cost performance. With it, the project team can identify issues early and take corrective action before problems begin. And one thing to note is the same characteristics happen with schedule control. And we'll talk about monitoring control later on, but the same thing with we have a schedule baseline and we can monitor that. And usually we monitor the schedule in terms of cost. So all of these things apply. In addition to internal costs, many projects depend on external goods and services, which brings us to procurement planning. Planning procurements and procurement management. Procurement planning determines what work or resources will be obtained externally and how those external relationships will be structured and managed. As projects become more complex, it's increasingly common that not all the work is performed by the internal project team. Organizations often rely on external vendors, contractors, consultants, or suppliers to provide specialized capabilities, materials, or services. Procurement planning is the process of deciding what needs to be obtained externally and how those external relationships will be structured. One of the first considerations is the make versus buy decision or make or buy decision. Whether the organization should perform the work internally or produce it from an outside store or procure it from an outside source. This decision is influenced by factors such as internal capability, cost, schedule constraints, risk, and strategic priorities. For example, a company may choose to outsource highly specialized work if it lacks the internal expertise, or it may keep work in-house if control or intellectual property is concerned. Once procurement needs are identified, the project team needs to define how vendors will be selected and managed. This includes establishing evaluation criteria, defining expectations, and determining the type of contractual arrangement that will govern that relationship. Procurement planning is closely tied to other planning areas. It affects costs because external services often represent a significant portion of the budget. It affects schedule because vendor timelines must be coordinated with project activities. It also affects risk because reliance on third parties introduces dependencies and uncertainties. The key takeaway is that procurement is not just purchasing activity, it's a strategic planning decision that directly impacts the project performance. But before we move on, we should look at the difference between the PMBOK 8 and what it says about procurement, because it made some changes. Procurement versus sourcing. And sourcing is what they're calling PMBOK 8 now. And the procurement activities have been defined as an organizational function. It's actually an appendix now in the PMBOK. All those other things have to happen that we talked about in the previous slide. But generally what we're seeing in practice nowadays is most of the contracting and doing the management of the vendors all kind of relies with a vendor management or a legal department. But the project team still needs to determine the sourcing strategy. So PMBOK 8 distinguishes between procurement as an organizational function and sourcing decisions as a project management level responsibility. It's an important conceptual distinction, and it reflects how project management has evolved in more recent times. In earlier, more process-driven views of project management, procurement was treated as something the project manager directly controlled. However, in most real organizations today, procurement is a centralized function. It includes policies, approved vendor lists, legal frameworks, contracting standards, and governance process that apply across all projects. This means that project teams typically do not operate independently when it comes to procurement. Instead, they work within established organizational systems. My experience over the last number of years is that this is exactly what happens. So we have maybe if the project is big enough, you might have somebody from legal or from procurement that's on your team, but most likely the project manager works as sort of as a point of contact, or you'll have someone in the procurement department that you work with, and your team's responsibility is to determine what needs to be sourced or procured and then communicate that information to the procurement department. And it's probably been 20 years since I worked on a project where I, as the project manager, had to worry about all the procurement sort of legal aspects of it. What the project team does control is sourcing. So sourcing refers to determining what needs to be obtained externally and how those external needs align with the project's delivery strategy. This includes decisions like whether to outsource work, what type of vendors needed, how vendors will be evaluated, and how procurement supports the project schedule and cost constraints. This distinction is consistent with the broader shift in the PMBOK guide towards a systems view of value delivery where projects operate within organizational structures rather than functioning as isolated entries. The key takeaway is procurement equals organizational capability and governance, while sourcing is project level decision making about external work. Understanding this distinction helps project managers navigate real world environments more effectively, especially in organizations with formal procurement departments. In this view, projects decide what they need, organizations define how it's acquired. With sourcing decisions defined, we can now look at how those decisions are formalized through contracts and agreements. Contracts and agreements shape external work. Contracts and agreements translate sourcing decisions into formal expectations about deliverables, responsibilities, timing, cost, and risk. Once a project decides to obtain work externally, contracts and agreements define how that external work will be governed. After procurement and sourcing decisions have been made, the next question is how those external relationships are formally structured. And this is where contracts and agreements become important. At a foundational level, we should understand that contracts are not just legal documents. In project delivery, they're management tools that help define what the seller is expected to provide, when performance is due, how payment will occur, and what conditions must be met for acceptance. Contracts also help reduce our uncertainty. Without a clear agreement, misunderstandings can arise over scope, timelines, quality, expectations, and reporting obligations or change procedures. A well-structured agreement helps both parties understand what success looks like and how the relationship will operate. Another important function of contracts is risk allocation. Different agreement structures can place more or less financial and performance risk on the buyer or seller. For example, some contracts create more cost certainty for the buyer, while others provide more flexibility when the work is uncertain or evolving. We don't need to do a deep level legal detail here, but we should understand that contract choice influences the project behavior and performance, and that'll be part of our sourcing strategy. This is why contracts should be aligned with the project scope clarity, schedule needs, uncertainty level, and management capacity. A poor fit between the work and the agreement can create friction, claims, delays, or cost problems later. In standard project management practice, agreements and contracts are recognized as important artifacts that support project delivery and procurement-related work. The key takeaway is that external work is not managed solely by purchase. It's managed through clear, structured agreements that support performance. Good agreements do more than authorize purchasing. They create clarity for delivery. Once the contracts are in place, now we need to manage vendor performance and integration throughout project delivery. Managing vendor performance during delivery. External work still requires active project management because vendor performance must be coordinated, monitored, integrated with the rest of the project. The main idea is that signing a contract does not remove management responsibility. It changes how part of the work is managed. The common misconception in project work is that once the contract has been signed, the external portion of the work is essentially taken care of. But in reality, that's when a different form of management begins. Projects that use vendors, contractors, or suppliers still need active oversight. The project team must monitor whether external work is progressing as expected, whether deliverables are meeting quality requirements, whether milestones are being achieved, and whether the vendor's work remains aligned with the larger project plan. This is especially important because vendor performance does not occur in isolation. External work usually connects to internal activities, internal decisions, and other project dependencies. If a vendor is late, incomplete, or unclear in its reporting, the consequences can ripple into schedule delays, rework, added costs, or disruption to other teams. We should understand that vendor management is not just about enforcement. It also includes communication, coordination, clarification of expectations, issue resolution, relationship management. In many cases, effective collaboration with a vendor is just as important as the original contract language. The takeaway here is that buying external support does not eliminate project management work. It shifts some of that work into managing performance across organizational boundaries. Taken together, schedule, cost, and procurement planning show that strong delivery depends on connected planning decisions rather than isolated plans. Integrating schedule, cost, and procurement decisions. Project performance depends on how well schedule, cost, and procurement decisions are aligned rather than managed as separate plans. The main idea is that these planning areas are interconnected. Interconnected decisions in one area may directly affect others. At this point, it's helpful to step back and connect the major planning areas that we've discussed, schedule, cost, and procurements. In practice, these are not independent planning activities. They're tightly interconnected, and decisions in one area may create consequences in the others. So, as I mentioned in the past, that we're kind of stepping through all these things in a sequential way, but in real life, a lot of these activities, the planning activities, are kind of going on all at once. For example, scheduled decisions may influence costs. If a project is accelerated, it may require more additional staffing, overtime, or expedited procurement, all of which increase costs. If the schedule is extended, costs may increase to longer resource commitments. Procurement decisions also affect both schedule and costs. Choosing to outsource work may reduce internal workload, but introduce independencies on vendor timelines. It may also change the cost structure from internal labor to contracted services. Similarly, cost constraints can drive changes in scheduling or sourcing. If the budget is limited, the project may need to adjust sequencing, reduce scope, or reconsider whether work is performed internally or externally. We should understand that strong project performance comes from coordinated decision-making. Planning is not about creating separate documents, it's about ensuring that decisions across scope, schedule, cost, and performance are aligned and they support integrated overall delivery. This integrated view reflects the systems perspective emphasized in modern project, where performance domains interact and must be managed together rather than in isolation. Projects perform better when planning decisions are integrated across delivery timelines. So as we conclude, we can summarize the key managerial takeaways from planning effective project strategy. Project management takeaways for effective project delivery. Effective project delivery planning depends on tailoring decisions, building realistic plans, and coordinating schedule, cost, and sourcing decisions as part of one integrated delivery strategy. Strong planning is less about producing more documents and more about making better connected decisions. As we conclude, it's useful to synthesize the main lessons from the planning topics we covered. First, effective planning begins with tailoring. Projects differ in size, uncertainty, stakeholder demands, complexity, and organizational setting. Because of that, project managers should not assume that every project's needs are the same model, the same level of documentation, or the same degree of structure. Good planning starts by choosing an approach that fits the work. Second, schedule planning should be grounded in delivery logic. A usable schedule is built from real activities, dependencies, milestones, and resource realities. It's not simply a set of targeted dates. If the schedule does not reflect how the work will actually happen, it will not support strong delivery performance. Third, cost planning should be understood as practical delivery. Costs come from the work, the people, the timing, the tools, and the external support required. A strong budget and baseline help the project team understand not only what the project is expected to cost, but how cost performance will later be monitored and managed. Fourth, sourcing and procurement decisions matter strategically. Projects often depend on outside vendors, suppliers, or services, and those external relationships affect schedule, budget, risk, and coordination. Project managers need to think carefully about what should be sourced externally and how that work will be integrated into the larger delivery effort. The broader lesson here is integration. Schedule, cost, and procurement should not be planned as isolated topics. Like I mentioned, these things kind of happen all together. They interact continuously, and the project performance improves when these decisions are made in a coordinated way. This systems-oriented view is consistent with PMI and modern project management's emphasis on tailoring, value delivery, and the interaction of planning-related domains and practices, rather than treating project management as a set of isolated documents. Planning adds value when it improves delivery, readiness, coordination, and control. So in conclusion, strong planning supports stronger delivery outcomes. Strong planning improves project delivery by increasing readiness, coordination, and control. Planning matters because it improves the project ability to execute effectively, adapt when needed, and deliver when intended. This closing slide brings the work for planning topics together to their larger purpose. The reason planning matters is not simply because project management expects plans to exist. Planning matters because it improves the project's ability to deliver successfully. When planning is done well, the team has a clear understanding of how work will be performed, how responsibilities connect, and what resources are needed, what outside support must be coordinated, and what the likely time and cost expectations are. That clarity improves delivery readiness. Strong planning also improves coordination. Projects depend on many moving parts, including internal activities, milestones, dependencies, budget constraints, and in many cases, vendor contributions. Integrated planning helps these pieces of work together rather than drift apart. Another benefit is control. Baselines, budgets, schedules, and procurement structures give the project team a reference point for monitoring progress and responding when performance differs from the plan. Without that structure, management becomes reactive and less effective. We should see that planning supports adaptability. Good planning does not eliminate change, but it gives the team stronger basis for responding to change in a disciplined way. The larger message is that planning is valuable because it supports better delivery outcomes. It strengthens readiness, improves coordination, and enables control, and ultimately helps the project create value more effectively. And this aligns with the course emphasis on project approaches, models, and artifacts. This should transition well into the wrap-up slide here. Planning is valuable not because it predicts the future, but because it prepares the project to deliver effectively in an uncertain environment. One of the most important ideas, especially in a foundations course, is understanding what planning is not. Planning is not about predicting the future with accuracy. Projects operate in environments with uncertainty and change and evolving information. Instead, planning is about preparation. It helps the project team think through how work will be performed, how decisions will be made, how resources will be used, and how the team will respond when things don't go exactly as planned. Good plans create structure and direction. They should not create rigidity. A project manager should not feel constrained by the plan. They should feel supported by it. The plan provides a baseline, a reference point, and a shared understanding, but it must evolve as the project evolves. This aligns strongly with modern project management thinking, which emphasizes adaptability, tailoring, and value delivery, rather than strict adherence to predefined processes. So planning is not just a technical activity, it's a managerial capability that supports better decision-making and more effective delivery. The goal is not a perfect plan. The goal is a project that can deliver. So that is the end, and I am 1 minute over. So I'm going to have to say goodbye, and I will see you all next week. How about that?